It started innocently enough. A piece of paper tucked into my jacket pocket one morning. It was folded neatly, with no name, no indication of who had left it. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, but the words were chilling. "Don't trust her," it said, simply. "She's not who you think she is." I thought it was a prank at first, some cruel joke. But then, the next day, there was another letter, hidden in the pages of the book I was reading, a faint smell of jasmine on the paper. This one was different. "She's watching you. She's always watching you." I was shaken. Who could have left these letters? How did they know? Was someone trying to warn me? Or was I just imagining it all? I told myself it was paranoia, that it was just my mind spiraling in the wake of everything strange that had been happening. But as the days passed, I began to question everything. The dreams, the letters, the way Ria's eyes seemed to change when she looked at me, it was all too much to ignore. I tried to confront her. I had to know if she was involved in all this, if she knew what was happening, or if it was all just in my head. I couldn't hold the tension inside me anymore. The fear, the doubt, the dread that had been growing with each passing day. One evening, after we had spent a few hours talking, I finally asked her, my voice barely above a whisper, "Ria, is there something you're not telling me?" She looked at me, her gaze steady but distant. There was a flicker in her eyes, a brief moment of something I couldn't identify, before she smiled again. But this time, there was something else behind it, something sharp, something cold. "No," she replied softly. "There's nothing I'm not telling you." But the words felt hollow. The tension in the air between us thickened, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was a silence, a heavy pause, before I saw something shift in her, something I couldn't place. It was as if she was suddenly aware of something, some shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't understand. Her expression softened for just a moment, and then, like a flicker of light in the dark, it disappeared. I wanted to ask her more, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat there, the silence between us stretching, feeling as though the very walls of the cafe were closing in on me, the shadows growing longer and darker. The unease I had felt for days now felt like a physical presence in the room. And then, from somewhere outside, I heard the faintest sound, a soft scraping, like nails on wood, just on the edge of hearing. I looked around, my heart skipping a beat, but the cafe was empty, the sound fading into the night. But the air was thick with something now, something I couldn't name. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly unraveling around me, something I couldn't quite see but could feel with every nerve in my body. The scraping sound outside, faint but persistent, had disappeared as quickly as it had come, but the silence that followed was unbearable. The cafe, once a place of calm, had become a theater of shadows. The walls, the dim lights, even the air felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something that none of us could avoid. Ria sat across from me, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those dark, endless eyes, seemed to be studying me in a way that made my skin crawl. I wanted to ask her more, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, not by fear of her, but by fear of what I was beginning to understand, that I was no longer in control of the situation. That whatever was happening, whatever was pushing me further into this web of unease, wasn't just about her. It was about something larger, something ancient, something tied to this place, this city, and maybe even to me. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cool breeze from the open window brush against my skin, but it did nothing to ease the heat that was building inside of me. The sun had long since set, and the street outside was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the world beyond the cafe now shrouded in darkness. But I couldn't look away from her. I couldn't look away from the girl who had somehow become the center of my world, the one who had so effortlessly woven herself into the fabric of my life. "Ria," I said quietly, my voice strained. "What's going on? What's happening to us?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movement graceful yet unerringly deliberate. The way she moved, like someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the space around her, who understood the power of silence, made my breath catch in my throat. She walked to the window and stood there, looking out into the night. For a long time, she didn't say a word. And I, foolishly, let the silence stretch between us, unable to break it. I was afraid of what I might hear, of what might spill out if I pushed her too hard. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as though she were sharing something too personal to be heard by anyone else. "Do you know, Karen," she began, her back still to me, "that some things are destined to happen? That no matter how much we fight against them, no matter how much we try to deny them, they'll always find a way to catch us?" I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Her words, so soft, so casual, sent a shockwave of fear through me. They felt too real. Too close. My heart began to race, but I couldn't move. It was as if her presence had anchored me to the spot. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to remain composed. She turned then, slowly, her eyes locking with mine. The intensity in them was different now. It wasn't the same warmth, the same gentle understanding that I had come to rely on. It was something darker, something far more unsettling. There was no warmth in her gaze now. It was cold, calculating, and for the first time since I had met her, I felt truly afraid of what she might say next. "You've felt it, haven't you?" she continued, her voice still soft, but now carrying an edge. "That feeling of being watched, of something lurking just behind you, waiting, always waiting? It's not your imagination, Karen. It's real." I stood up then, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp in the thick air. "What are you saying? What do you mean?" She took a step toward me, and I couldn't move. Her proximity felt like a storm, like the air itself was charging with static. I wanted to step back, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey my mind. "You were chosen," she said, the words slow and deliberate, each one sinking into me like a weight I couldn't lift. "You don't remember, do you? You don't remember what happened that night?" Her words hit me like a thunderclap, and I felt my legs buckle beneath me. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wooden table behind me. The edges of the world blurred for a moment, and my mind scrambled to piece together the fragments of memories that had been swirling in the back of my mind, just out of reach. What night? What was she talking about? "You can feel it now, can't you?" she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost like a caress. "The weight of it. The darkness that has been creeping into your life, into your heart. It was always there, Karen. Waiting for the right moment." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding my mind. No, this doesn't make sense." "You're not making sense." But her eyes, those eyes, remained fixed on me, unblinking, unyielding. The terror that had been building inside me over the past few days was now threatening to consume me. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I had to leave, to escape whatever this was before it swallowed me whole. But before I could move, Ria took a step forward, and the air in the room seemed to change. It was as if the very temperature had dropped, and the light in the cafe flickered for a split second, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. She was standing too close now, her presence overwhelming, suffocating. "You don't remember," she said again, her voice thick with something else now. "But I do. And it's too late to stop it, Karen. You can't escape it. You never could." Her smile, twisted and dark, was the last thing I saw before everything around me seemed to collapse. The walls seemed to close in, the cafe vanishing into a blur of shadows. The floor beneath me felt unstable, like it was shifting, warping, and then I was falling through the darkness, through the thick fog of dread that had clouded my every waking moment. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the cafe. The world was quiet. Too quiet. I stood up, my legs shaky, and looked around. I was in an unfamiliar place, an empty room, dimly lit, the walls closing in on me, pressing against me with a force I couldn't understand. The air smelled musty, like old wood in decay, and the temperature was freezing, colder than anything I had ever felt before. And then, I saw her. Ria was standing across the room, her silhouette barely visible in the dark. Her eyes glowed, faintly, like embers in the night. Her face was pale, and her smile, that same twisted smile, was stretched across her face, wider now, more predatory. "You remember now, don't you?" she asked, her voice echoing in the silence. "It was always meant to be this way. You and I, we were never meant to be apart." The walls closed in further, and I realized, with a sickening sense of finality, that I had fallen into her world, the world she had been hiding from me all along. The world where nothing was what it seemed, where everything was a lie. I could hear whispers now, voices swirling around me, growing louder. They were calling my name over and over, but I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape her. The room began to spin, and I stumbled forward, reaching out for something, anything, to steady myself, but there was nothing there. I could feel her presence moving closer, hear the soft rustle of her clothes as she stepped toward me, and I knew, in that moment, that I was lost. And then, she spoke again, her voice a low murmur in the growing darkness. "It's too late, Karen. You're already mine." The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a mixture of fleeting colors that seemed to reflect the mood in my heart. I leaned against the old, weathered railing of the balcony, staring out into the quiet streets below. The city of Jaipur had always felt like a dream, a blend of modernity and tradition, where the sounds of honking cars mingled with the whispers of history in the air. It was here, in this city, where everything had begun, the chapter of my life that felt both like a memory and a possibility. I was still trying to make sense of it all. I had always believed in love, or at least in the idea of it. But that belief was tested the moment I met her. She wasn't like the others, the ones I had known before, the ones who smiled in all the right places but never really felt like home. No, she was different. Her presence was like a quiet storm, one that didn't announce itself but left a mark that lingered long after it had passed. I met her on a day when nothing special was supposed to happen. I had come to the cafe, as I usually did, to lose myself in the pages of some book or to sit with a coffee in hand and stare out the window at the chaos of life. But that day, the wind had a different plan for me. She had walked in, or rather, glided in, like someone who didn't need to announce her arrival. Her presence was like a soft, sweet melody that somehow made the noise around me quieter. She was tall, with dark hair that curled around her face, framing her features in a way that felt almost deliberate. Her eyes, though, those eyes were what made everything else fade away. They were deep, the kind of brown that seemed to hold secrets I knew I would never understand, yet could never stop wanting to know. I remember how she had walked up to the counter with such grace, not hurried, not trying to be noticed, but still commanding a sort of quiet attention. She ordered her drink, a simple chai, with a politeness that spoke of a kindness I wasn't accustomed to. And then, without a glance, without so much as a passing acknowledgement, she had taken a seat by the window. I couldn't help myself. I found my gaze drifting towards her, as if the pull of her presence was magnetic, compelling. I didn't want to stare, I was never one to stare, but something in me wanted to learn her, to understand why my heart had begun to race in the way it had. Was it just a fleeting attraction? Or something more? The minutes passed, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I had always been the quiet one, the observer. I found comfort in watching people, seeing their stories unfold without ever being a part of them. It was easier that way, safer, too. But she seemed different. There was something about her that made me question all the walls I had built around myself. She wasn't the kind of person you could ignore, not if you wanted to truly live. The moment she stood up, I was ready to let her slip away, to let this fleeting encounter become just another forgotten memory. But then, she had turned, and her gaze met mine. It wasn't an accidental glance. No, it was deliberate, soft, as though she had been waiting for me to look, to see her. And I did. I saw her. For a long moment, neither of us moved. It wasn't awkward, not at all. It was more like two souls recognizing each other in a room full of strangers. It was in that moment, I think, that I first realized what I had been missing all these years. Not a person, but the possibility of something pure, something real, something honest. Her lips curled into the smallest of smiles, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It was like she knew something I didn't, a secret only she could understand. The smile was so small, so unassuming, but it had the power to make me feel seen in a way I had never experienced before. She walked towards the door, and I watched her go, the sound of her steps fading into the background noise of the cafe. But in that quiet moment, I realized that I had been holding my breath, waiting for her to turn back, to look at me once more. But she didn't. She simply disappeared into the world outside, leaving me behind with the hollow echo of her presence. The next few days were strange. I couldn't get her out of my head. She had left an imprint on my soul, a mark that I couldn't erase no matter how hard I tried. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was beautiful. It wasn't just the way she looked at me, though that had felt like something out of a dream. It was the feeling she left in the air, the weight of something unspoken, something that lingered between us even when we weren't together. I returned to the cafe every day, hoping to see her again. But she never came. I began to wonder if she was real, if perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe she was just a figment of my imagination, a momentary illusion, something the heart conjured up in moments of longing. But then, a week later, when I least expected it, I saw her again. It was the same cafe, the same table by the window. She was there, sipping her chai with the same graceful air about her, lost in her own world. She didn't notice me at first, and I didn't want to disturb her. But this time, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own life. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. I gathered my courage, stood up, and walked over to her. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little rough, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting." She looked up, her eyes locking with mine once more, and that same smile, the one that made everything in the world seem a little less heavy, appeared on her face. "I don't mind at all," she replied softly, her voice like music to my ears. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The words that I had rehearsed in my mind, the ones I thought would be perfect, had all vanished. Instead, I sat down opposite her, not asking permission but simply claiming my space in this small moment of serendipity. "I've seen you here a few times," I said, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the nerves creeping up on me. "I come here often, but I don't think we've ever properly met." She tilted her head slightly, as if thinking about something. Then, without hesitation, she offered her hand. "Ria," she said, her voice light yet sincere. I took her hand in mine, the warmth of her touch sending a jolt of something electric through me. I had no idea what would happen next. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the quiet understanding between us, the fact that we had crossed paths in this vast, chaotic world, and for some reason, it felt right. As the days passed after that first meeting, I found myself returning to the cafe with a sense of anticipation that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. It had been so long since I had felt this way about someone, so uncertain, so exposed. Every moment I spent with Ria, whether we were talking or sitting in silence, seemed to stretch into eternity, and yet, it always ended too soon. We spoke of many things, some trivial, some more meaningful, but always with an undercurrent of something deeper, something neither of us dared to fully acknowledge. Our meetings became regular. She would arrive in the late afternoon, when the light was soft and the cafe's windows reflected the slow-moving shadows of the streets. I would always be there, as though waiting for her to arrive. Sometimes we would talk for hours, discussing the books we loved, the music that defined our lives, the dreams we had. There was a comfort in her presence, like a familiar song I had forgotten, but once I heard again, it felt like home. But over time, things began to change, subtly at first, like the shift of seasons that you don't notice until one day, the air feels different. It started with the silences. At first, they had been comfortable. Moments when we could just sit, lost in the presence of each other without needing to fill the air with words. But slowly, those silences began to feel heavy, as if they were filled with something unspoken. I would catch her staring out of the window, her eyes distant, as though her mind was elsewhere, and when I looked at her, she would quickly avert her gaze, as if I had interrupted something deep and private. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she was going through something. I didn't want to overthink it. After all, we hadn't known each other long enough for me to truly understand what was going on inside her. But still, there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, like an old wound that had started to sting again, even though I couldn't remember how it had gotten there. One evening, as we sat across from each other, sipping our drinks in that familiar corner by the window, I noticed something different. Ria was looking at me, but her expression was unreadable. It was as though she were seeing me, but at the same time, she was looking right through me, as if I were a ghost, a fleeting presence that didn't quite belong. It was unsettling, that look, and I couldn't quite place why. "Ria?" I said, my voice soft, almost hesitant. She blinked, her focus snapping back to me as if she had been lost in some thought too deep to share. Her lips curved into a smile, but it wasn't the same smile. It was smaller, tighter, forced. "Sorry, I was just thinking," she said, her voice faint. "Sometimes my mind wanders." I nodded, but something in her tone, in the way she said those words, unsettled me. It wasn't the first time I had heard her speak like this. Over the past week, her moods had shifted, like the weather before a storm, calm on the surface, but with a heaviness hanging in the air that you couldn't ignore. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right. Then came the dreams. The first night it happened, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dream had been vivid, unsettling. I had been sitting with Ria in a cafe, but the atmosphere had been wrong. The lights were dimmer, and the air felt thick, like it was hard to breathe. Ria was there, but she wasn't herself. She was sitting across from me, but her eyes were different. Dark, empty, as though something was watching me through her. And then, in the dream, she smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was cold, twisted, as though she knew something I didn't. I tried to speak, but my voice was trapped, and then everything around me began to warp, the cafe walls stretching and cracking, like the world was being torn apart. I woke up with a gasp, the images of that dream still vivid in my mind. My body was shaking, and for a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming. I tried to push it away, telling myself that it was just a nightmare, just my mind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The dreams came again the next night, and then again the night after that. Each time, they grew more intense, more real. Ria's presence in the dream became darker, more sinister. I could feel it, the way she watched me with those eyes, the way her smile twisted into something grotesque, like it was mocking me. Every time I woke up, the fear lingered longer, and the unease began to seep into my waking life. I would glance at Ria across the table, and for a fleeting moment, I would see her eyes shift, just slightly, as though something in her had changed. I couldn't tell her about the dreams. I didn't even know how to explain them. How could I? How could I tell her that every time I closed my eyes, I saw something that made my skin crawl, something that made me question if I really knew her at all? And then came the letters.